Chapter 8. The wind and the rain shook leaves from the overhanging trees and hurled them onto the pavement. They smacked the windshield and clung briefly, bat-like shapes that furled their wings and fell away when the wipers swept over them. Joey remained about 100 yards behind the other car, not quite close enough to discern what make and model it was. He told himself that he still had time to turn around, drive to the county road, and go to Scranton as he had planned. But he might not have the option of turning back if he got a good look at the car ahead of him. Intuitively, he understood that the more he learned about what was happening, the more thoroughly his fate would be sealed. Mile after mile, he was driving farther away from the real world, into this otherworldly land of second chances, and eventually the intersection of the county route and Coal Valley Road would cease to exist in the night behind him. When they had gone only 3 miles, they came upon a white two-door Plymouth Valiant, a car that Joey had admired as a kid but hadn't seen in ages. It was stopped at the side of the road, broken down. 3 sputtering red flares had been set out along the shoulder of the highway, and in their intense light, as if by a dark miracle of transubstantiation, the falling rain appeared to be a downpour of blood. The vehicle that he was following slowed, almost halted beside the Valiant, then accelerated again. Someone in a black hooded raincoat stood beside the disabled Plymouth, holding a flashlight. The stranded motorist waved at him, imploring him to stop. Joey glanced at the dwindling taillights of the car that he had been pursuing. It would soon pass around a bend, over a rise, out of sight. Coasting past the Plymouth, he saw that the person in the raincoat was a woman. A girl, really. Arrestingly pretty. She appeared to be no older than 16 or 17. Under the hood of the coat, her flare-tinted face reminded him curiously of the haunting countenance on the statue of the Virgin Mother at Our Lady of Sorrows back in Asherville. Sometimes the Virgin's serene ceramic face had just such a forlorn and spectral aspect in the crimson glow of the flickering votive candles arrayed in red glasses beneath it. As Joey rolled slowly past this girl, she stared entreatingly, and in her porcelain features he saw something that alarmed him, a disturbing premonition, a vision of her lovely face, without eyes, battered and bloody. Somehow he knew that if he didn't stop to help her, she would not live to see the dawn, but would die violently in some black moment of the storm. He parked on the shoulder ahead of the Valiant and got out of the rental car. He was still soaked from having stood in the cleansing downpour outside Henry Kadinska's office little more than 20 minutes ago, so the pounding rain didn't bother him, and the cold night air wasn't half as chilling as the fear that had filled him since he had learned of his inheritance. He hurried along the pavement, and the girl came forward to meet him at the front of her disabled Valiant. "Thank God you stopped," she said. Rain streamed off her hood, a glistening veil in front of her face. He said, "What happened?" "It just failed." "While you were rolling?" "Yeah. Not the battery." "How do you know?" "I've still got power." Her eyes were dark and huge. Her face glowed in the flare light, and on her cheeks raindrops glistened like tears. "Maybe the generator," he said. "You know cars?" "Yeah." "I don't," she said. "I feel so helpless." "We all do," Joey said. She gave him a peculiar look. She was just a girl, and at her age she was surely naive and not yet fully aware of the world's cruelty, yet Joey Shannon saw more in her eyes than he could comprehend. "I feel lost," she said, evidently still referring to her lack of knowledge about cars. He unlatched and raised the hood. "Let me have your light." At first she seemed not to know what he meant, but then handed the flashlight to him. "I think it's hopeless." While rain pounded against his back, he checked the distributor cap to be sure that it was seated securely, examined the spark plug leads, scrutinized the battery cables. "If you could just give me a ride home," she said. "My dad and I can come back here tomorrow." "Let me try it first," he said, closing the hood. "You don't even have a raincoat," she worried. "Doesn't matter. You'll catch your death. It's only water. They baptize babies in it." Overhead, the branches of the mountain laurels clattered in a bitter gust of wind. Shaking loose a flock of dead leaves, it whirled briefly, but then settled to the ground as spiritlessly as lost hope sifting down through the darkness of a troubled heart. He opened the driver's door, got behind the steering wheel, and put the flashlight on the seat beside him. The keys were in the ignition. When he attempted to start the engine, there was no response whatsoever. He tried the headlights, and they came on at full power. In front of the car, the girl was caught in the bright beams. She was no longer tinted red. Her black raincoat hung like a cowled robe, and in its folds her face and hands were white and gloriously radiant. He stared at her for a moment, wondering why he had been brought to her and where they would find themselves by the time this strange night had ended. Then he switched off the headlights. The girl stood once more in the lambent light of the flares, lashed by crimson rain. After leaning across the seat to lock the passenger door, Joey got out of the Valiant, taking the flashlight and the keys with him. "Whatever's wrong, I don't have what's needed to fix it." He slammed the driver's door and locked it as well. "You're right. The best I can do is give you a lift." "Where do you live?" "Coal Valley. I was on my way home when the trouble started." "Hardly anyone lives there anymore." "Yeah, we're one of the last 3 families. It's almost like a ghost town." Thoroughly soaked and cold to the bone, he was eager to get back to the rental car and switch the heater to its highest setting. But when he met her dark eyes again, he felt more strongly than ever that she was the reason that he had been given another chance to take the road to Coal Valley, as he should have done 20 years ago. Rather than run with her to the shelter of the Chevy, he hesitated, afraid that whatever he did, even taking her home, might be the wrong thing to do, and that in choosing a course of action he would be throwing away this last, miraculous chance at redemption. "What's wrong?" she asked. Joey had been staring at her, half mesmerized, contemplating the possible consequences of his actions. His empty gaze must have disconcerted her every bit as much as the concept of consequences disconcerted him. Speaking without thinking, surprised to hear these particular words issuing from himself, he said, "Show me your hands." "My hands?" "Show me your hands." The wind sang epithalamion in the trees above, and the night was a chapel in which they stood alone. With a look of puzzlement, she held out her delicate hands for his inspection. "Palms up," he said. She did as he asked, and her posture made her resemble more than ever the Mother of Heaven, entreating all to come unto her, into the bosom of everlasting peace. The girl's hands cupped the darkness, and he couldn't read her palms. Trembling, he raised the flashlight. At first her hands were unblemished, then a faint bruise slowly appeared in the center of each rain-pooled palm. He closed his eyes and held his breath. When he looked again, the bruises had darkened. "You're scaring me," she said. "We should be scared." "You never seemed strange." "Look at your hands," he said. She lowered her eyes. "What do you see?" he asked. "See? Just my hands." The storm wind crying in the trees was the voice of a million victims, and the night was filled with their pathetic pleading for mercy. He would have been shaking uncontrollably if he had not been paralyzed by fear. "You don't see the bruises." "What bruises?" Her gaze rose from her hands and her eyes met his again. "You don't see?" he asked. "No." "You don't feel?" In fact, the bruises were not merely bruises anymore, but had ripened into wounds from which blood began to ooze. "I'm not seeing what is," Joey told her, overcome by dread. "I'm seeing what will be." "You're scaring me," she said again. She wasn't the dead blonde in the blood-stained plastic shroud. Under her hood, her face was framed by raven-black hair. "But you might end up like her," he said, more to himself than to the girl. "Like who?" "I don't know her name. But she wasn't just an hallucination. I see that now. Not a drunk's delirium. More than that. She was something else. I don't know." The grievous stigmata in the girl's hands became more terrible by the second, though she continued to be unaware of them and seemed to feel no pain. Suddenly, Joey understood that the increasing grisliness of his paranormal vision meant that this girl was in growing danger. The fate for which he had been destined, the fate that he had postponed by taking Coal Valley Road and stopping to his sister, was grimly reasserting itself. Delaying by the side of the road was apparently the wrong thing to do. "Maybe he's coming back," Joey said. She closed her hands, as if shamed by the intensity with which he stared at them. "Who?" "I don't know," he said, and he looked into the distance along Coal Valley Road, into the impenetrable gloom that swallowed the 2 rain-swept lanes of blacktop. "You mean that other car?" she asked. "Yeah." "Did you get a glimpse of whoever was in it?" "No." "A man?" But I didn't see him clearly. A shadow, a shape. Why does it matter? I'm not sure. He took her by the arm. Come on, let's get out of here. As they hurried toward the Chevy, she said, You sure aren't anything like I thought you'd be. That struck him as a peculiar statement. Before he could ask her what she meant, however, they reached the Chevy, and he stumbled to a halt, stunned by what stood before him, her words forgotten. Joey? She said. The Chevy was gone. In its place was a Ford, a 1965 Mustang, his 1965 Mustang. The wreck that as a teenager he had lovingly restored with his dad's help, midnight blue with white-walled tires. What's wrong, she asked. He had been driving the Mustang that night 20 years ago. It had sustained major body damage when he had spun out on the interstate and collided with a signpost. There was no body damage now. The side window, which had shattered when his head hit it, was intact. The Mustang was as cherry as it had ever been. The wind picked up shrieking, so the night itself seemed mad. Silvery whips of rain lashed around them and snapped against the pavement. Where's the Chevy? He asked shakily. What? The Chevy, he repeated, raising his voice above the storm. What Chevy? The rental car. The one I was driving. But you were driving this, she said. He looked at her in disbelief. As before, he was aware of mysteries in her eyes, but he had no sense that she was trying to deceive him. He let go of her arm and walked to the front of the Mustang, trailing one hand along the rear fender, the driver's door, the front fender. The metal was cold, smooth, slick with rain, as solid as the road on which he stood, as real as the heart that knocked in his chest. 20 years ago, after he'd hit the signpost, the Mustang had been badly scraped and dented, but it had been drivable. He had returned to college in it. He remembered how it had rattled and ticked all the way to Shippensburg, the sound of his young life falling apart. He remembered all the blood. Now, when he hesitantly opened the driver's door, the light came on inside. It was bright enough to reveal that the upholstery was free of bloodstains. The cut that he'd suffered in his forehead had bled heavily until he'd driven to a hospital and had it stitched, and by that time the bucket seat had been well spattered, but this upholstery was pristine. The girl had gone around to the other side of the car. She slipped into the passenger seat and slammed the door. With her inside, the night seemed as utterly empty of life as a pharaoh's crypt undiscovered beneath the sands of Egypt. All the world might have been dead, with only Joey Shannon left to hear the sound and know the fury of the storm. He was reluctant to get behind the steering wheel. It was all too strange. He felt as though he had surrendered entirely to a drunkard's delirium, although he knew that he was stone sober. Then he remembered the wounds that he'd foreseen in her delicate hands, the premonition that the danger to her was increasing with every second they remained at the roadside. He got in behind the wheel, closed the door, and gave her the flashlight. Heat, she said, I'm freezing. He was barely aware of being sodden and cold himself. For the moment, numb with wonder, he was sensitive only to the deepening mystery, to the shapes and textures and sounds and smells of the mystical Mustang. The keys were in the ignition. He started the engine. It had a singular pitch, as familiar to him as his own voice. The sweet, strong sound had such nostalgic power that it lifted his spirits at once. In spite of the flat-out weirdness of what was happening to him, in spite of the fear that had dogged him ever since he'd driven into Asherville the previous day, he was filled with a wild elation. The years seemed to have fallen away from him. All the bad choices that he'd made were sloughed off. For the moment, at least, the future was as filled with promise as it had been when he was 17. The girl fiddled with the heater controls, and the hot air blasted from the vents. He released the emergency brake and put the car in gear, but before he pulled onto the highway, he turned to her, said, "Show me your hands." Clearly uneasy, regarding him with understandable wariness, she responded to his request. The nail wounds remained in her palms, visible only to him, but he thought that they had closed somewhat. The flow of blood had diminished. "We're doing the right thing now. Getting out of here," he said, although he knew that he was making little, if any, sense to her. He switched on the windshield wipers and drove onto the two-lane blacktop heading toward the town of Coal Valley. The car handled like the fine-tuned masterpiece that he had remembered, and his exhilaration intensified. For a minute or two he was entirely possessed by the thrill of driving, just driving, that he had known as a teenager but never since, deep in the thrall of the Mustang, a boy and his car, lost to the romance of the road. Then he remembered something that she had said when he had first seen the Mustang and had halted before it in shock. "Joey." She had called him by his name. "Joey, what's wrong?" Yet he was certain that he had never introduced himself. "Some music?" she asked with a nervous tremor in her voice, as though his silent, rapturous involvement with the unrolling road was more disturbing to her than anything he'd previously said or done. He glanced at her as she leaned forward to switch on the radio. She had pushed back the hood of her raincoat. Her hair was thick and silky and darker than the night. Something else she'd said, which had struck him as peculiar, now came back to him. "You sure aren't anything like I thought you'd be. And before that, you never seemed strange." The girl twisted the tuning knob on the radio until she found a station playing Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road. "What's your name?" he asked. "Celeste. Celeste Baker." "How did you know my name?" The question made her self-conscious, and she was able to meet his eyes only briefly. Even in the dim backwash of light from the instrument panel, he could see that she was blushing. "You never noticed me, I know." He frowned. "Noticed you?" "You were 2 years ahead of me at County High." Joey shifted his attention from the dangerously slick roadway longer than he should have, mystified by what she'd said. "What are you talking about?" Staring at the lighted face of the radio, she said, "I was a sophomore when you were a senior. I had a terrible crush on you. I was in despair when you graduated and went off to college." He was barely able to look away from her. Sweeping around a curve, the road passed an abandoned mine head and a broken-down tipple that loomed out of the darkness like the half-shattered skeleton of a prehistoric beast. Generations had toiled in its shadow to bring forth coal, but they were now gone to bones or city work. As he followed the curve, Joey braked gently, slowing from 50 to 40, so badly rattled by what the girl had said that he no longer trusted himself to drive safely at the higher speed. "We never spoke," she said. I never could get up the nerve. I just, admired you from afar." God, sounds so stupid. She glanced at him from under her brow to see if, in fact, he was amused at her expense. "You're not making any sense," he said. "Me? How old are you, 16? 17, almost 18. My dad's Carl Baker, and being the principal's daughter makes everything worse. I'm a social outcast to begin with, so I have a hard time striking up a conversation with a boy who's even half as good-looking as you." He felt as if he were in a chamber of funhouse mirrors where everything, including conversation, was distorted until nothing quite made sense. "What's the joke here?" "Joke?" He slowed to 30 miles an hour, then slowed further still until he was not quite keeping pace with the racing water that nearly overflowed a wide drainage ditch along the right shoulder of the highway. The surging torrents cast back leaping, silvery reflections of the headlights. "Celeste, damn it, I'm 40 years old. How could I be just 2 years ahead of you in high school?" Her expression was somewhere between astonishment and alarm, but then it swiftly gave way to anger. "Why are you being like this? Are you trying to spook me?" No, I just trying to give the principal's kid a real scare, make a fool of her? No, listen, you've been away to college all this time, and you're still that immature? Maybe I should be glad I never had the guts to talk to you before." Tears shimmered in her eyes. Nonplussed, he returned his attention to the highway ahead, just as the Springsteen song ended. The DJ said, "That's Thunder Road from Born to Run, the new album by Bruce Springsteen." "New album," Joey said. The DJ said, "Is that hot or not? Man, that guy is going to be huge." "It's not a new album," Joey said. Celeste was blotting her eyes with a Kleenex. "Let's spin one more by the boss," said the DJ. "Here's She's the One off the same album." Pure, passionate, exhilarating rock and roll exploded from the radio. She's the One was as fresh, as powerful, as joyful as it had been when Joey had first heard it 20 years ago. He said, "What's this guy talking about? It's not new. Born to Run is 20 years old." "Stop it," she said in a voice colored half by anger and half by hurt. "Just stop it, okay?" It was all over the radio back then. He knocked the whole world on its ass. The real stuff, Born to Run. "Give it up," she said fiercely. "You're not scaring me anymore. You're not going to make the principal's nerdy kid cry." She had fought back her tears. Her jaw was clenched and her lips were tightly compressed. "Born to Run," he insisted, "is 20 years old." Creep. 20 years old. Celeste huddled against the passenger door, pulling as far away from him as she could get. Springsteen rocked. Joey's mind spun. Answers occurred to him. He dared not consider them, for fear that they would be wrong and that his sudden rush of hope would prove unfounded. They were traveling through a narrow passage carved from the mountain. Walls of rock crowded the blacktop and rose 40 feet into the night, reducing their options to the road ahead and the road behind. Barrages of cold rain snapped with bullet-hard ferocity against the Mustang. The windshield wipers throbbed. Lub-dub, lub-dub, as though the car were a great heart pumping time and fate instead of blood. At last he dared to look at the rearview mirror. In the dim light, he could see little, but what little he could see was enough to fill him with wonder, with awe, with wild exhilaration, with fear and with delight simultaneously, with respect for just how very strange the night and the highway had become. In the mirror his eyes were clear, and the whites of them were luminescent white. They were no longer bleary and bloodshot from 20 years of heavy drinking. Above his eyes his brow was smooth and unlined, untouched by 2 decades of worry and bitterness and self-loathing. He jammed his foot on the brake pedal, the tires shrieked, and the Mustang fishtailed. Celeste squealed and put out her hands to brace herself against the dashboard. If they had been going fast, she would have been thrown out of her seat. The car skidded across the double yellow line into the other lane toward the far rock wall, but then slid into a 180-degree turn, back into the lane where they'd begun, and came to a stop on the roadway facing the wrong direction. Joey grabbed the rearview mirror, tilted it up to reveal a hairline that had not receded, tilted it down past his eyes, left, right. "What are you doing?" she demanded. Though his hand was shaking uncontrollably, he found the switch for the dome light. "Joey, we could be hit, head on," she said frantically, though there were no headlights approaching. He leaned closer to the small mirror, turned it this way and that, craned his neck, trying to capture every possible aspect of his face in that narrow rectangle. "Joey, damn it, we can't just sit here." "Oh, my God. My God. Are you crazy?" "Am I crazy?" he asked his youthful reflection. "Get us off the road." "What year is it?" "Drop the stupid act, you moron." "What year is it?" "It isn't funny." "What year is it?" he demanded. She started to open her door. "No," Joey said. Wait. Oh. All right, you're right. Got to get off the road. Just wait." He swung the Mustang around, back in the direction they had been heading before he'd slammed on the brakes, and he pulled to a stop on the side of the road. Turning to her, pleading with her, he said, "Celeste, don't be angry with me. Don't be afraid. Be patient. Just tell me what year it is. Please, please. I need to hear you say it, then I'll know it's real. Tell me what year it is, and then I'll explain everything, as much as I can explain it." Celeste's schoolgirl crush on him was still strong enough to overcome her fear and anger. Her expression softened. "What year?" he repeated. "It's 1975, she said. On the radio, She's the One rocked to its glorious end. Springsteen was followed by a commercial for the current big hit in the movie theaters, Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon. The past summer it had been Jaws. Steven Spielberg was just starting to become a household name. The previous spring, Vietnam had fallen. Nixon had left office a year before. Amiable Gerald Ford was in the White House, caretaker president of a troubled country. Twice in September, attempts had been made on his life. Lynette Fromm took a shot at him in Sacramento. Sarah Jane Moore went after him in San Francisco. Elizabeth Seton had become the first American to be canonized by the Roman Catholic Church. The Cincinnati Reds won the World Series in 7 games. Jimmy Hoffa had disappeared. Muhammad Ali was world heavyweight champion. Dr. O's novel Ragtime. Judith Rosner's Looking for Mr. Goodbar. Disco. Donna Summer. The Bee Gees. Now, although still soaked, he realized that he wasn't wearing the suit in which he had attended the funeral, and which he had been wearing when he'd fled Henry Kadinska's law office. He was in boots and blue jeans, hunter's plaid flannel shirt, blue denim jacket with sheepskin lining. "I'm 20 years old," Joey whispered as reverentially as he once would have spoken to God in the hush of a church. Celeste reached out and touched his face. Her hand was warm against his cold cheek, and it trembled not with fear but with the pleasure of touching him, a difference that he was able to sense only because he was young again, and acutely sensitive to the currents of a young girl's heart. "Definitely not 40, she said. On the car radio, Linda Ronstadt launched into the title song from her current hit album, Heart Like a Wheel. 20 years old, he repeated, and his vision blurred with gratitude to whatever power had brought him to this place, this time, this miraculous passage. He wasn't merely being given a second chance. This was a shot at a whole new beginning. "All I've got to do is the right thing," he said. "But how will I know what it is?" Rain beat, Beat, beat on the car with all the fury of judgment drums, moving her hand from his cheek, smoothing his rain-soaked hair back from his forehead. Celeste said, "Your turn." "What?" "I told you what year it is. Now you're supposed to explain everything." "Where do I start? How do I make you believe?" "I'll believe," she softly assured him. "One thing I know for sure. Whatever I've been brought back here to do, whatever I'm supposed to change, you're at the center of it. You're at the heart of it. You're the reason that I have hope for a new life, and any better future I might have hinges on you." As he'd spoken, her comforting hand had withdrawn from him. Now she held it over her heart. For a moment the girl seemed unable to breathe, but then she sighed and said, "You get stranger by the minute, but I'm starting to like it. Let me see your hand." She took her right hand from her heart and turned it palm up. The dome light was still on, but even that didn't provide enough light for him to read the meaning of the stigmata. "Give me the flashlight," he said. Celeste handed it to him. He switched on the beam and studied both her palms. The wounds had been fading when last he looked. Now they were deep again and oozing blood. Reading the reawakened fear in his face, she said, "What do you see, Joey?" "Nail holes." "There's nothing." "Bleeding." "There's nothing in my hands." "You can't see, but you've got to believe." Hesitantly, he touched her palm. When he raised his finger, the tip of it glistened with her blood. "I can see it. I can feel it," he said. "It's so frighteningly real to me." When he looked at her, she was staring wide-eyed at his crimson fingertip. Her mouth was an oval of surprise. You must have cut yourself." "You can see it?" "On your finger," she confirmed, a tremor in her voice. "In your hand?" She shook her head. "There's nothing on my hands." He touched another finger to her palm. It came away wet with her blood. "I see it," she said tremulously. "2 fingers." Transubstantiation. The precognitive vision of blood in her hand had been transformed by his touch and by some miracle into the real blood of her body. She touched the fingers of her left hand to the palm of her right, but they found no blood. On the radio, Jim Croce, not yet dead in a plane crash, was singing "Time in a Bottle." "Maybe you can't see your own fate by looking at yourself," Joey said. "Who of us can? But somehow through me, through my touch, you're being, I don't know, being given a sign." He gently pressed a third finger to her palm, and it too came away slick with blood. "A sign," she said, not fully grasping what was happening. "So you'll believe me," he said. "A sign to make you believe. Because if you don't believe me, then I might not be able to help you. And if I can't help you, I can't help myself." "Your touch," she whispered, taking hold of his left hand in both of hers. "Your touch." She met his eyes. "Joey, what's going to happen to me? What would have happened if you hadn't come along?" "Raped," he said with total conviction, although he didn't understand how he knew. "Raped, beaten, tortured, killed." "The man in the other car," she said, gazing out at the dark highway, and the tremor in her voice became a shudder that shook her whole body. "I think so," Joey said. "I think he's done it before. The blonde wrapped in plastic." "I'm scared." "We have a chance." "You still haven't explained. You haven't told me. What about the Chevy you thought you were driving, being 40 years old?" She released his hand, leaving it covered with her blood. He wiped the blood on his jeans. With his right hand, he focused the flashlight on her palms. "The wounds are getting worse. Fate, your destiny, whatever you want to call it, it's reasserting itself. He's coming back? I don't know. Maybe, somehow, when we keep moving, you're safer. The wounds close up and start to fade. As long as we're moving, change can happen. There's hope." He switched off the flashlight and gave it to her. He popped the handbrake and drove back onto Coal Valley Road. "Maybe we shouldn't go the way he went," she said. "Maybe we should go back to the county route, to Asherville, or somewhere else, anywhere else, away from him. I think that would be the end of us. If we run, if we take the wrong highway like I did before, then there's not going to be any mercy in heaven. Maybe we should get help." "Who's going to believe this?" "Maybe they'll see my hands, the blood on your fingers when you touch me." "I don't think so. It's you and me. Only you and me against everything." "Everything?" she said wonderingly. Against this man, against the fate you would have met if I hadn't taken the turn onto Coal Valley Road, the fate you did meet on that other night when I took the county route instead. You and me against time, and the future, and the whole great weight of it all coming down like an avalanche. What can we do? I don't know. Find him. Face him. We just have to play it as it lays, do what seems right, minute by minute, hour by hour. How long do we have to do the right thing, whatever it is, to do the thing that'll make the change permanent? I don't know. Maybe until dawn. The thing that happened that night happened in darkness. Maybe the only thing I have to set right is what happened to you. And if we keep you alive, if we just make it through to sunrise, maybe then everything's changed forever. The tires cut through puddles on the rural lane, and plumes of white water rose like angels' wings on both sides of the car. "What's this other night you keep talking about?" she asked. She gripped the extinguished flashlight in both hands in her lap, as though afraid that something monstrous might fly at the Mustang from out of the darkness, a creature that could be repelled and banished by a withering beam of light. As they drove through the deep mountain night toward the nearly abandoned town of Coal Valley, Joey Shannon said, "This morning, when I got out of bed, I was 40 years old, a drunk with a rotting liver and no future anyone would want. And this afternoon, I stood at my father's graveside, knowing I'd broken his heart. Broken my mom's heart, too." Celeste listened raptly, able to believe, because she had been given a sign that proved to her that the world had dimensions beyond those she could see and touch. Chapter 9. Out of the radio came "One of These Nights" by the Eagles, "Pick Up the Pieces" by the Average White Band, Ronstadt singing "When Will I Be Loved," Springsteen pounding out "Rosalita," Blackwater by the Doobie Brothers, and all of them were new songs, the big hits of the day, although Joey had been listening to them on other radios in far places for 20 years. By the time he had recounted his recent experiences to the point at which he had seen her disabled Valiant, they had reached the top of the long slope above Coal Valley. He coasted to a stop in gravel at the side of the road beside a lush stand of mountain laurels, though he knew that they couldn't linger for long without risking a reassertion of the pattern of fate that would result in her murder and in his return to living damnation. Coal Valley was more a village than it was a town. Even before the insatiable mine fire had eaten a maze of tunnels under the place, Coal Valley had been home to fewer than 500 people, simple frame houses with tar shingle roofs, yards full of peonies and lush huckleberry bushes in the summer, hidden under deep blankets of snow in the winter, dogwood trees that blazed white and pink and purple in the spring, a small branch of County First National Bank, a one-truck volunteer fire station, Polanski's Tavern, where mixed drinks were rarely requested, and most orders were for beer, or for beer with shooters of whiskey on the side, where huge jars of pickled eggs and hot sausages and spicy broth stood on the bar, a general store, one service station, a small elementary school. The village wasn't big enough to have streetlights, but before the government had finally begun condemning properties and offering compensation to the dispossessed, Coal Valley produced a respectable warm glow in its snug berth among the surrounding night-clad hills. Now all the small businesses were shuttered and dark. The beacon of faith in the church belfry had been extinguished. Lights shone at only 3 houses, and those would be switched off forever when the final residents departed before Thanksgiving. On the far side of town, an orange glow rose from a pit where the fire in one branch of the mine maze had burned close enough to the surface to precipitate a sudden subsidence. There the seething subterranean inferno was exposed, where otherwise it remained hidden under the untenanted houses and the heat-cracked streets. "Is he down there?" Celeste asked, as though Joey might be able to sense clairvoyantly the presence of their faceless enemy. The fitful precognitive flashes he had experienced thus far were beyond his control, however, and far too enigmatic to serve as a map to the lair of the killer. Besides, he suspected that the whole point of his being allowed to replay this night was to give him the chance to succeed or fail, to do right or do wrong, drawing only on the depth of his own wisdom, judgment, and courage. Coal Valley was his testing ground. No guardian angel was going to whisper instructions in his ear, or step between him and a razor-sharp knife flashing out of shadows. He could have driven straight through town without stopping, Joey said. He could have gone to Black Hollow Highway and maybe from there to the Turnpike. That's the route I usually took back to college. But I think he's down there, somewhere down there, waiting. For us? He waited for me after he turned off the county route onto Coal Valley Road. Just stopped on the roadway and waited to see if I was going to follow him. Why would he do that? Joey suspected that he knew the answer. He sensed suppressed, sharp-toothed knowledge swimming like a shark in the lightless sea of his subconscious, but he couldn't entice it to surface. It would soar out of the murky depths and come for him when he was least expecting it. Sooner or later we'll find out, he said. He knew in his bones that confrontation was inevitable. They were captured by the fierce gravity of a black hole, pulled toward an inescapable and crushing truth. On the far side of Coal Valley, the glow at the open pit pulsed brighter than before. Streams of white and red sparks spewed out of the earth like great swarms of fireflies, expelled with such force that they rose at least 100 feet into the heavy rain before being quenched. Fearful that a fluttering in his belly could quickly grow into a paralyzing weakness, Joey switched off the dome light, steered the Mustang back onto Coal Valley Road, and drove toward the desolate village below. "We'll go straight to my house," Celeste said. "I don't know if we should." "Why not?" "It might not be a good idea. We'll be safe there with my folks." "The idea isn't just to get safe." "What is the idea?" "To keep you alive." "Same thing." "And to stop him." "Stop him?" "The killer." "It makes sense. I mean, how can there be any redemption if I knowingly turn my back on evil and walk away from it? Saving you has to be only half of what I need to do. Stopping him is the other half." "This is getting too mystical again. When do we call in the exorcist, start spritzing holy water?" "It is what it is. I can't help that." "Listen, Joey, here's what makes sense. My dad has a gun cabinet full of hunting rifles, a shotgun. That's what we need." "But what if going to your house draws him there? Otherwise, maybe your parents wouldn't be in danger from him, would never encounter him." "Shit, this is deeply crazy," she said, "and you better believe I don't use the word shit often or lightly." "Principal's daughter," he said. "Exactly. By the way, a little while ago what you said about yourself, it isn't true." "Huh? What did I say?" "You're not nerdy." "Well, you're beautiful." "I'm a regular Olivia Newton-John," she said self-mockingly. "And you've got a good heart. Too good to want to change your own fate and ensure your future at the cost of your parents' lives." For a moment she was silent in the roar of the sanctifying rain. Then she said, "No, God, no, I don't want that. But it would take so little time to get into the house, open the gun cabinet in the den, and load up." "Everything we do tonight, every decision we make, has heavy consequences. The same thing would be true if this was an ordinary night, without all this weirdness. That's something I once forgot, that there are always moral consequences, and I paid a heavy price for forgetting. Tonight it's truer than ever." As they descended the last of the long slope and drew near the edge of town, Celeste said, "So what are we supposed to do? Just cruise around, stay on the move, wait for that avalanche you talked about to hit us?" "Play it as it lays." "But how does it lay?" she asked with considerable frustration. "We'll see. Show me your hands." She switched on the flashlight and revealed one palm, then the other. "They're only dark bruises now," he told her. "No bleeding. We're doing something right." The car hit a narrow band of subsidence in the pavement, not a deep pit with flames at the bottom, just a shallow swale about 2 yards wide. Although it was rough enough to jolt them, make the car's springs creak, scrape the muffler, and spring open the door on the glove box, which evidently had not been closed tightly. The flapping door startled Celeste, and she swung the flashlight toward it. The beam flared off a curve of clear glass in that small compartment. A jar, 4 or 5 inches tall, 3 to 4 inches in diameter. Once it might have contained pickles or peanut butter. The label had been removed. It was filled with a liquid now, which was made opaque by the glimmering reflections of the flashlight beam, and in the liquid floated something peculiar, not quite identifiable, but nevertheless alarming. "What's this?" she asked, reaching into the glove box without hesitation, but with a palpable dread, compelled against her better judgment, just as Joey was, to have a closer look. She withdrew the jar, held it up. Floating in pink-tinted fluid were a pair of blue eyes. Chapter 10. Gravel rattled against the undercarriage. The Mustang thumped across a depression, and Joey tore his gaze from the jar in time to see a mailbox disintegrate on contact with the front bumper. The car churned across the lawn of the first house in Coal Valley and came to a stop just inches before plowing into the front porch. Instantly, he was cast into a memory from the first time that he had lived through this night, when he had failed to take the turn off to Coal Valley. Driving the Mustang recklessly fast on the interstate in a night full of rain and sleet in a frenzy to escape as though a demon were in pursuit of him, torn up about something, alternately cursing God and praying to him. His stomach is acidic, churning. There's a roll of Tums in the glove box. Holding the wheel with one hand, he leans to the right, punches the latch release, and the door on the dashboard drops open. He reaches into the small compartment, feeling for the roll of antacid, and he finds the jar. Smooth and cool. He can't figure what it is. He doesn't keep a jar of anything in there. He takes it out. The headlights of an oncoming big rig on the far side of the divided highway throw enough light into the car for him to see the contents of the jar. Eyes. Either he jerks the wheel reflexively or the tires hydroplane on the slick pavement, because suddenly the Mustang is totally out of control, sliding, spinning, the signpost, a terrible crash. His head smacks against the window, safety glass shattering into a gummy mass, but cutting him nonetheless. Rebounding from the steel signpost, slamming into the guardrail, stopped. He forces open the damaged door and scrambles out into the storm. He has to get rid of the jar. Dear Jesus, get rid of it before someone stops to help him. Not much traffic in this killing weather, but surely someone will be a good Samaritan when that is the last thing he needs. He's lost the jar. No, he can't have lost the jar. He feels around frantically in the car, the floor in front of the driver's seat. Cool, glass, intact. The lid still screwed on tight. Thank God. Thank God. He runs with it past the front of the car to the guardrail. Beyond is wild land, an open field full of tall weeds. With all the strength he can muster, he hurls the jar far into the darkness. And then time passes, and he finds himself still standing on the verge of the highway, not sure what he's doing there. Confused. Sleet stings his exposed face and hands. He's got a fierce headache. He touches his forehead, finds the cut. He needs medical attention. Maybe stitches. There's an exit 1 mile ahead. He knows the town. He can find the hospital. No Samaritan has stopped. It's that kind of world these days. When he gets back into the battered Mustang, he's relieved to discover that it's still operable, and that the damaged fender isn't binding against the front tire. He's going to be all right. He's going to be all right.